Welcome, and welcome back to Be Lifted, the online church of King of Kings Lutheran in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My name is Marie Duquette, and I am blessed to be the pastor at both King of Kings and Be Lifted, now beginning its third year online. Normally on this second Sunday of Christmas, while we imagine the three magi majestically making their way to give gifts to the newborn Christ, we would hear the story of King Herod and how he decreed the slaughter of all innocent boys under the age of 2 in his attempt to make sure his throne was not threatened by Jesus. And so we think of the families of all those baby boys crying out in horrific grief. Because we are using Will Gaffney's new lectionary, instead, today we will hear words from the prophet Micah, who wrote also during a time of horrible injustice and violence and fear, followed by words of hope from the Gospel of John. It is a new year, a new day. Let us prepare our hearts to be challenged and comforted by the word of the Lord.
From the prophet Micah in chapter 4. For all the peoples walk, each in the name of their God. Yet we will walk in the name of the ageless one, our God, forever and ever. In that day, a prophetic utterance of the compassionate one. I will assemble the lame, and I shall gather those who have been driven away and those who have been harmed. I will transform the lame into a remnant and the outcast into a strong nation. And the majestic one shall reign over them in Mount Zion from now and forevermore. And you, Migdal Eder, watchtower of the flock, hill of daughter Zion, to you it shall come. The former dominion shall come, the queenship of daughter Jerusalem. Now why do you scream, shout? Is there no sovereign in you? Has your counselor perished, that you have been seized by writhing pain like a woman birthing? Writhe and let loose, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the saving God will redeem you from the hands of your enemies. Rise and thresh, daughter Zion, for I will make your horn iron and your hoofs bronze. Here ends the reading.
The words from the prophet Micah that you just heard may not have sounded familiar to you. So I want to remind you that Micah is also the prophet famous for saying, "And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." All of which is part of the mission statement of this church. The book of Micah is attributed to an 8th century Judean prophet. The first 3 chapters of Micah present God's case against the very people whom God has chosen for a special covenantal relationship. It also foretells that disaster is on the way, that it was at a time when the priests and the rulers of the day fed the people false optimism. When reality befalls them, Micah's task is to alert the people to the danger and to challenge their reliance on the hope that God would always protect them, no matter their flagrant disobedience. Today's reading began with chapter 4 of that same book. Chapters 4 and 5 include more hopeful words than the first 3 chapters, but the prophet's words are still not always filled with hope. Chapter 4 contains announcements of impending suffering and assurances of Israel's eventual deliverance from all its enemies. Although better times are promised, there's also a clear recognition that much trouble must be endured before hopes will be realized. Throughout chapters 4 and 5, we sense a strong desire for relief from oppression, a return of what was lost, and maybe even something better. A world in which God reigns supreme, God is recognized by all, and justice is finally a reality. And you might have noticed in verse 8 that Jerusalem is referred to as Migdal Eder, also watchtower of the flock. That kind of language can sometimes distract us. It's confusing. But think about it this way. We might call Detroit, Detroit, or the Big D, or the Motor City. Each of those names refers to the same place, just as Migdal Eder, or watchtower, or watcher of the flock, all refers to Jerusalem. Another aspect of this reading that you might have noticed was that the images are fairly violent. Holy war language is used to describe how the spoils of war will be devoted to the Lord rather than kept for personal gain. The prophet Micah does not promise that all suffering is deserved or can be avoided, but the message moves beyond immediate misfortunes to a glorious future that God has in mind for the people. I tell you all this to help you better understand what you just heard from the prophet Micah, and also because it strikes me as considerably relevant to the way we might be feeling today. Today, January 2nd, 2022, as we enter the third year of a pandemic we originally thought we would get through in 3 weeks. Today, when we are beginning to hear increasingly that we need to learn how to live with the pandemic because it will be with us for a long time. And even as we accept that we need to learn with it, it seems daily all the rules of how to do that continue to change. Today, when we are painfully aware of the effects of climate change as we watch fires in Boulder, Colorado, which we've almost gotten used to, but not in December and January, I need not run down the complete litany of all the things that concern us at the dawn of 2022. But what I can say is that we are not the first people in history to have such overwhelming concerns. Maybe it surprised you, as it did me, that one of the last books written by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whom we lost this week, was called The Book of Joy. He wrote it with his dear friend, the Dalai Lama. These two spiritual giants in this book discuss how they maintained a sense of joy despite Desmond Tutu's work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sought to facilitate healing in South Africa following the systemic genocide known as apartheid. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission brought together the guilty to face the families of their victims. While there's some debate about how effective the Truth and Reconciliation work was in lessening the pain of those whose lives had been forever changed by the violence perpetrated against their villages, their homes, and their loved ones, it's hard to argue against the courageous faith it took to hold the ideals on which it was based. As James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." That brings me to today, this interesting place in history we are standing. It seems every day we have no choice but to face yet more of the things that desperately need to be changed. Systemic racism, poverty, government corruption, and practices that continue to threaten the very planet we call home. And to do this work while juggling day-to-day living, raising children, taking care of loved ones, and battling a pandemic is enough to bring despair upon even the most fervent optimist. Which brings me to today's gospel. From the Gospel of John, chapter 1, beginning with verse 1, which you may recognize. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being through him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Yeah, the comforting words of our faith. But listen to how these same familiar verses have been translated by Wilda Gaffney. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was with God in the beginning. Everything came into being through the Word, and without the Word, not one thing came into being that came into being. What has come into being in the Word was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the bleakness, and the bleakness did not overtake it. It is understandable that we might have a bleak outlook these days. Hopefully not every day, and certainly not every minute. But let's face it, with so many complicated, monstrous problems on the table, it's easy to feel like the bleakness is gaining on us. And yet, just as there is a list of things we must face before they can be changed, there is also a list of things that have already changed. Things that are better than they were a year ago. On the day that I recorded this, support groups were meeting inside the building of our church. A year ago, that was not possible. 204 million people in the United States are now fully vaccinated against the coronavirus. This time last year, we were still praying for a vaccine. Juneteenth is now officially a national holiday. On Christmas Eve 2021, we had roughly 118 folks and 4 dogs show up on the front lawn of King of Kings in the cold to sing carols and light candles, and nearly half of them were not members of this church, but folks from the neighborhood and friends of friends. We are facing the things that need to be changed. And facing them is how we allow ourselves to be used by God to usher in something new, just as God has promised. The things that I mentioned, that was just a off-the-cuff list of 4 things. There are so many more. When I was walking Nala this week, I was reflecting on Will Gaffney's translation of verse 5, moving from the light shines in the darkness to the light shines in the bleakness, moving from and the darkness has not overcome it, moving to and the bleakness has not overtaken it. Overtaken it makes me think of moving, a journey, walking, running, wheeling, with something pursuing us. In this case, bleakness. Except that in my heart of faith, the next thing I thought of was the ending of the 23rd Psalm, quite possibly the most well-known piece of scripture in the entire world. At the end of that psalm, it's the best translation we have, tells us, surely mercy and goodness will pursue us all the days of our lives, and we will live in the house of the Lord forever. And when I imagine the bleakness trying to overtake us while the mercy and goodness of God pursue us, I cannot imagine the bleakness winning. The mercy and the goodness of God that pursues all God's beloved people has been in pursuit thousands of years. And when we look back at history, we can see where it set people free, where it broke down walls, where it helped people look at hard things that were piled on the table so they could be a part of changing them and working for justice. If we focus on the bleakness trying to overtake us, it just might. And if we remember that the mercy and goodness of God always pursues us, even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we need not fear any evil, any bleakness. One of the things I learned this week when I was looking into how people used their faith to get through really difficult times was I read about all the musicians that performed and wrote music while they were in concentration camps, especially during World War II. I did not know that there were so many. I wondered what it was like to perform music in that place at that time. I hope that the music took them to another place in their heart and soul in which they were free. But I can't help thinking, despite what we are all facing today, that if regular humans like you and I could compose and perform music while in concentration camps, often at the request of their captors, you and I can live through a time such as this too. May music continue to return to us. May we continue to imagine and allow God's creative energy to help us find ways to sing together again as we did on Christmas Eve. And may that same music set us all free. Steve, the first time that I heard you play this, I was struck by the beauty of it, but also by how the violin at the very end reminded me of keening. Can you tell me a little bit about the story that goes with this?
This music arose under highly unusual circumstances, and circumstances that we would wish on no other human being. It's part, in fact, it's the final part, the final movement of Olivier Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time, Quatuor pour la fin du temps. And this quartet was written for not the usual string quartet or what have you, but the instruments that happened to be available in the locale in which he found himself, which was Stalag 8A in Görlitz, Silesia, where he had been taken a prisoner of war by the Nazis. And you can imagine prisoner of war camps are brutal. not high on creature comforts, and certainly not high in pianos that happened to be in tune. But there was a piano and a pianist, the composer, a clarinetist, and a violinist, and a cellist. And Messiaen wrote for the instruments available. This movement is called Louange à l'immortalité de Jésus, praise to the immortality of Jesus. Everybody is going to respond to this differently, but I feel this sense of timeless radiance that sometimes, that at one point, a climactic point, explodes into a succession of E major chords which connote warmth and brightness and bedazzlement, and you think you've arrived at the goal, and then you realize you haven't. It goes onward and upward into the ether, which is where you heard keening, a sentiment of mourning entirely appropriate to the circumstances under which this arose, and I think appropriate to the sonority at the end. The instruction here is perdendosi, losing itself, just sort of evaporating into the void.
At this time, I'd like to thank you for continuing to contribute to the work of this church. Our ministries of feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, studying racism, making a space that is inclusive of all people. If you would like to give at this time, you can text a donation to this number right here. It's that easy. I'd also like to add that whether you give or not, one way you can also help our ministry in 2022 is by sharing this video. People need the Lord. They need good news. They need hope. They need the gospel. And one way you can help make that happen is to share this with people you know who need to be lifted.